Good afternoon, and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Sushma Raman, the Executive Director, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome today Nicholas Opiyo, Carr Center Fellow and Scholar at Risk at Harvard University. We'll be talking about closing civic space in Africa, and in particular Uganda. Now, closing civic space is neither a new phenomenon nor is it transient. It's really part of a set of trends that are occurring globally, connected to the rise of authoritarianism, attacks on human rights defenders and journalists, and restrictive laws that limit the ability of people to assemble freely, to participate in civic life, and to express their opinions on social media and digital media and in other ways. There are, of course, significant implications for government accountability and for a healthy and democratic public sphere. Joining us to discuss these issues and how they manifest in Uganda and implications for Africa is Nicholas Opiyo, who has been a fellow at the Carr Center now over the past year. Nicholas is a really distinguished and well-regarded human rights lawyer from Uganda, known for campaigning on issues of civil rights, political freedoms, freedom of speech and the press, and LGBTQ rights. He recently won the Tulip Human Rights Prize from the Dutch government. I'm going to turn it over now to Nicholas to give us remarks, after which we will engage in a Q&A, and we welcome questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fishma, for that very warm introduction. Sometimes when I hear people introduce me, I wonder whether it's me they're introducing. When they ask me to introduce myself, I just like to say I am just a human rights lawyer. So thank you very much for your very kind words. Thank you to Matthias and all the folks at the Carr Center for hosting me over the last couple of years. It's been a difficult year, but it's been made a whole lot easier by being here at the Carr Center. This evening, I'm delighted to present to you part of my ongoing work on the study of closing civic space in Africa. Today, I'm offering lessons from Uganda. Many times, and as you may have seen in the flyer, people use the term closing and shrinking civic space interchangeably. My own preference is to use what Shushma has used, which is closing civic space. And the reason that I prefer to use the term closing civic space is because the actions of closing is more deliberate. It is contemplated and calculated to achieve a particular result. And in my view, what is happening is it's not an happenstance, but rather a calculated, deliberate attempt by states to close civic space in Uganda. So I'll use the term closing civic space. There's no doubt that all over the world, there's deep concerns now on closing civic space. Even in all democracies that we had in the past thought were established democracies, we're beginning to see signs of regression, of closing civic space. And the examples are abound in Europe, the examples in Hungary, Poland, examples that show that even in those established, democratic system, there is a closing of civic space. But none is more steep and more concerning than the trends that we're witnessing on the African continent. And a couple of things really, in my view, explain what I see as a spiraling or an increase in trend in the closing civic space. One, it has to do with what Shushma said, the rise of populist governments around the world. But in specific reference to Africa, it is what I see as a decline in the democratic order on the continent. Many African countries, if you look at the indices being produced by Freedom House, or indeed by USAID's Civil Society Sustainability Index, will demonstrate to you over the last decade, there's been a decline in the respect for basic rights and freedoms, this is linked to the quality of governance, the state of democratic order on the continent. We will begin to see the rise of coup d'etats now in West Africa. In many parts of Africa, you have long-serving African leaders. My own country of Uganda, you have a leader who has been in power since I was 6 years old, or in American terms, since Ronald Reagan, and shows no sign of leaving power. So this is not a coincidence. Rather, I think for me, it's a product of this trend we're witnessing on the African continent. Now, a couple of ways or means are applied in closing civic space. Oftentimes when we speak about closing civic space, we're not very specific about the ways in which this is being applied. And I'm just going to outline to you what I see as the trends, especially from Uganda. The first one is what I see as the rise of legislative restrictions. In Uganda in 1995, we enacted a constitution that was hailed worldwide as very progressive because of the Bill of Rights that in many ways reflected global human rights standards. But over the years, what you've seen is a continuing drawback on the freedoms that were provided for in the Bill of Rights. And this is happening across the African continent. In countries that had promised brighter futures, you've seen a complete decline and a departure from the rule of law. And in Uganda, what you see is enactment of legislation, the use of legal processes to restrict the space for enjoyment of rights and freedoms. These normally express themselves in enactment of legislations that purport to promote these rights, but instead inhibit them through restrictive legislative requirements. For instance, the legislations, broadly speaking, create first and foremost a negative presumption against free and peaceful organizing by the peoples of these countries. In essence, what the legislation provides is that in order to be able to exercise your rights or freedom, you must register and get a permit from the state. In the case of the non-profit sector or the civil society, in the Ugandan case, what has happened is that all forms of free, unregistered citizens organizing has been legislated so that in order to be able to do that, you must register with the National NGO Board. If you do not register, you risk being arrested or being prosecuted for operating an illegal organization. So any form of voluntary association, by definition of the law, has to be registered. And these registration processes are oftentimes so burdensome, so cumbersome. In the case of Uganda, you are required to register first with the company registry to be able to get a company registration as a nonprofit. And after registering as a nonprofit, you are then required to apply for registration for a certificate of registration with the National NGO Board. Once you register with the National NGO Board, you then apply for a permit. And that permit is issued to you on a yearly basis. Besides getting a permit, the NGOs are also required to sign memorandum of understanding with districts authorities where they operate. Now, Uganda has 120 plus districts. You can imagine how difficult that is for an organization as a national organization. So these registration requirements are intended to make it difficult or nearly impossible for anyone to register and enjoy the rights and the freedom of association. There are groups in the country that are not even allowed to register, just on account of the sort of work that they do. In the case of Uganda, LGBT organizations cannot register legally and operate legally in Uganda because the laws provide that their work is against the moral, ethical values of the country. And so this process of registration, this requirement for registration by its own operation would not allow LGBT organizations, for example, to register. There's a very interesting case in Uganda that's still making its way in the court system for the umbrella organization for sexual minorities called Sexual Minorities Uganda. When they thought to challenge the system by trying to register an organization called Sexual Minorities Uganda, they were refused registration on account of their name. And the explanations given by the authorities was that their name is itself unlawful as it seeks to promote unlawful activities in the country. And so you can see that registration is being used not to provide a conducive atmosphere, but rather to lock out groups such as LGBT organizations. If by any luck or chance you register, the requirement for reporting are so onerous in the sense that you can actually spend the whole year trying to report to state agencies as opposed to doing the work for which you are registered. In our case in Uganda, you have to report to nearly 6 different state agencies every single year. You have to report to the company registry because you're registered as a company limited by guarantee or a non-profit company. You also have to register with the National NGO Bureau that creates a reporting requirement. You have to report and register with the Financial Intelligence Authority, which is an anti-money laundering body in the country. So even if you're registered, the reporting requirements are so onerous so that it becomes nearly impossible for anyone to be able to operate freely. The second broad measure being taken by states across the African continent is the limitation of access to resources. By their own nature, civil society organizations depend on support from the global south because it's difficult to raise money locally. Many organizations depend on support from global nonprofit foundations. And in order to be able to survive, they need these resources. So what states have begun to do is to pass legislation that prohibits receipt of access to resources from these countries. In the case of Uganda, the approach has been slightly different because in countries like Ethiopia, you have a specific law on how much money you can receive. But in Uganda, 2 things are being done. The first is the official narrative being created by government that these NGOs who access resources from the global south are agents of foreign power, that they are being used with nefarious intent to destabilize the country. This narrative has become so dominant that people who even benefit from this kind of interventions are beginning to believe it. It is intended to delegitimize the work of civil society organizations in the country. The second approach that the state has taken in Uganda is simply an administrative, in the sense that any income that's being received from outside the country, first, there's a requirement that now is required that you must go through the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance must be aware of that resource and must know where the money is from, what the purpose is for. And so there's a limitation of access of resources by the civil society as a means of restricting and closing of the space to operate. The other way is really the use of what I call anti-money laundering and anti-terror financing laws. The presumption is that civil society organizations are a conduit for terror financing. And oftentimes, these allegations are labeled against entities. Their bank accounts are frozen, their leaders are arrested, and then spend months in the court system. In the run-up to the elections, for example, in Uganda, the National NGO Forum, which is an independent association of all NGOs in the country, had their accounts frozen on allegations that were involved in terror financing. The Uganda Women's Network women rights organization, a network organization, also had their accounts frozen. Now, this matter is in the court system. We are defending them in the courts. It's awaiting a judgment of the court. But the accounts were frozen on account of allegations that they were involved in terror financing, essentially mobilizing people around free and fair elections were termed terror financing. And these organizations' accounts were frozen. And so the use of these laws to take over bank accounts, to freeze bank accounts, to commence criminal prosecutions against leaders of these organizations is another of the tactics that we are seeing increasingly being used across the African continent. In Kenya, the cases of the cases in Mombasa around organizations involved in radicalism, was also the case where they were accused of terror financing, and their accounts were also frozen. The same thing has happened in Tanzania with several other organizations. So the use of anti-terrorism measures as well as money laundering measures to restrict civic space has become so pervasive. And I think that it is important to dwell a little bit more on this point because it brings in the element of the role of international community. And all of this has its origin, in my view, in what I see as the well-intended set of recommendations put together by the G7. I don't know how many of you may have read about this, but the G7 in 1989 established what they call the Financial Action Task Force, which was a task force of the G7 countries intended to curtail money laundering across the world. And so this group of G7 plus the European Union put together a task force whose role was to advise these governments on measures to curb money laundering across the world. This action task force came up with what they call the 40 recommendations. So in 1990, they issued what was called the 40 recommendations, which was supposed to be a comprehensive plan on addressing money laundering across the world. Interestingly, this body has what they call observers. So you have, the World Bank, IMF observers in this group whose intention is to come up with measures and recommendations to address money laundering. In 2001, this task force came up with an additional set of recommendations, what were called the 9 recommendations. In addition to money laundering, these recommendations targeted what they termed as terror financing across the world and provided measures on what they could do to fight terror financing. The presumption was then that this had become a problem and that many parts of the world were being used to finance activities of terror groups. In 2004, the same group added one more recommendations, and that became known as the 40+9 recommendations that essentially established rules for fighting both money laundering and terror financing. And the thing about this is that it did include what they call sectors at risk of being used for terror financing as well as money laundering. And the nonprofit sector was included as a risk entity, a risk sector to be watched and used, watched for their use for this kind of crimes. All these were good stuff, except that what you then began to see happening as a result of these 40+9 recommendations were that governments in the global south began to use these recommendations over and above the intended purposes. So in countries like Uganda, we saw the emergence of legislation around the NGO sector, legislation around money laundering, legislations around financing terrorism. And in the case of Uganda, these legislations were being enacted not because there was a real problem of terror financing, but because there was a threat of blacklisting of the country as a black spot for terror financing by the Financial Action Task Force. So on really a threat of being blacklisted, the country enacted laws that in so many ways were an affront to basic freedoms and rights. And I'll just give you an example. Now, in the case of Uganda, it established what is called the Financial Intelligence Authority, which has broad powers to monitor every financial transaction being conducted in the country. This alongside the central bank, which also has a similar mandate. But this new financial institution can freeze the bank account of any organization or individual without recourse to courts. In effect, they will freeze your accounts and then begin due process later. Granted broad powers that are being used, in the case of NGOs, to freeze bank accounts of NGOs and individuals. In my own case, as many of you know, I was charged in Uganda with money laundering. Eventually, the charges were withdrawn. But again, without basis, without due process, they can just assert that they think you're being used for money laundering. What we also saw was, besides legislation that was being enacted, in the Ugandan case, these laws were amended sometimes 3 times a year to meet the requirements of the Financial Action Task Force. But we've also seen the establishment of regional groups that have association with the Financial Action Task Force. I think there are about 9 right now. Of the 9, 4 from the African continent. So you have, for example, the East and Southern African Money Laundering Group. You have the Task Force for Money Laundering in Central Africa. You have the Intergovernment Task Force for Money Laundering in West Africa, and then you have one for the MENA region. Again, these groups are groups that are being used to enact legislation and recommend to government measures that are being used to restrict civil liberties in Uganda. Now, besides all of this, and again, it's what we see as the unintended or misapplication of global terror financing and money laundering laws to restrict civic space. We've also begun to see targeted attacks on specific groups. I mentioned the case of ethnic minorities, but in the case of Uganda, you've now begun to see the role of multinational companies in especially attacking environmental rights groups. As many of you may know, Uganda recently began the process of extracting and exporting oil. We've signed oil agreements with French and Chinese oil companies. We are building an oil pipeline from Uganda through Tanzania to the Indian Ocean for export of crude oil. But there are many organizations that have been working around rights of local communities to compensation, the effect of this exploration on the environment. And what we see is this continuous attack on groups that are involved in this kind of activities, principally coming from a collusion of both the state and private sector interests. In the case of Uganda, you had groups that have sought to cut down an entire forest to plant sugarcane. Environmental rights activists who have been advocating against this attempted destruction of the forest have faced numerous threats to their lives, have been arrested, have been shot, have been intimidated, and some of the organizations have been closed at the insistence of private commercial interest. And so the threat to civic space on the continent comes not just from the state, but we've now begun to increasingly see the role of the private sector, especially multinational companies. In the case of Uganda, it's French oil companies, Chinese oil companies, and other interests across the globe. The question then is, because oftentimes people ask, you've diagnosed the problem, what is the solution? I think for me, the solution lies, in my view, in 3 broad areas. The first really is in this global system that has inspired repression across the African continent. And there's a window of opportunity here because last year, 2021, in February, the Financial Action Task Force began a process of reviewing their regulations because there was global outcry from the global south about the misapplication of the Financial Action Task Force guidelines by governments. And so the task force eventually succumbed to this call and began a process of conducting a study to do what they call a study on mitigating the unintended consequences of FATF standards. Now, I think for me, this presents an opportunity. Unfortunately, this is going without much discussion in the academia, in civil society. I think this is an opportunity for us to be able to influence these standards that have inspired actions against civil society in the country. The first phase of this exercise will start with the publication of what they call a stock take, a learning of lessons on how states have used these standards to abuse fundamental rights and freedoms. So there's an important opportunity to infuse in this process for both the academia and practitioners to be able to reform the Financial Action Task Force standards to ensure that they are right-respecting, to put in place systems for safeguards against abuse by states, but also more importantly, in my view, to streamline this within the global human rights systems, because it appears the Financial Action Task Force is operating nearly parallel to the global human rights system. The World Bank and other UN agencies are observers in this group, but don't play a pivotal role in determining the affairs of the group. I think that it's important now to use this opportunity as an opportunity to streamline the work of the G7 plus the European Union in the broader human rights work. And this would require greater participation from UN special procedures, especially the ones on fighting global terror, as well as the one on assembly and association. I also think it is an opportunity for the greater human rights body of the UN to get involved in the work and standard setting by the Financial Action Task Force. At this moment, I don't think there's a lot of debate in the academia or in civil society about what this process can do for reforming the system to ensure that it is right respecting. The action taken by FATF seeks to, among other things, de-risking, delisting, and discussing issues of financial exclusion, as well as the study on undue targeting on the nonprofit sector by FATF standards. I do think that this is an opportunity as much for the NGOs as it is for the academia to be able to be involved, to determine, to influence this discussion. The last thing really in terms of what I see as a solution is the use of the global human rights litigating infrastructure to challenge these actions, because unless this is challenged, it is going to become the new standard, and states across the African continent, and as you've seen now in Uganda, will continue to use this as a tool for limiting the space for the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms on the continent. So that's my 30 minutes. Thank you. I appreciate if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for those really powerful remarks and reminding us of the importance of addressing this issue in order to ensure healthy democracy and citizen participation. So I have lots of questions, and we would welcome questions from the audience as well. So you talked about some of the solutions that you see in this very complex scenario, and I'm wondering about other ways in which to engage the everyday person, the citizen in Uganda and in other countries in mobilizing around these issues. So yes, change does come from the top, whether you think of the global human rights infrastructure or the role of regulatory bodies and standard setting institutions in developing norms and frameworks and so on. But what are your thoughts in terms of movements on the ground in terms of resisting or reshaping these narratives and outcomes?
Great. You're absolutely right that there has to be a groundswell of opposition to this kind of rule and practice, and there's space for that. But I think that the human rights community is guilty of, in my view, a very abstract exposition of normative frameworks as a solution to the problem. We are always quick to advocate for new rules and regulations. What we have seen is that the problem is not a lack of normative framework, rather a political will to do the right thing. And that will can only be reversed by a groundswell. The second thing is that when, and many of us who are grassroots activists are guilty of this, is that we are dealing with a population that is impoverished, that is starving. And if you go to them and say, you have a right or freedom of association, or of demonstration, or a peaceful protest, it will make absolutely no sense. But if you begin to make a connection between their lived experiences and the possibilities that observing these rights can present to them, we begin to see a more proactive group of people responding to those questions. I'll give you an example. When we were leading the campaign against corruption in Uganda, we simply had to make the case to the people that corruption is not just something that happens at the national level with ministers and governments, and that grand corruption is really the reason they don't have proper schools, the reasons they don't have proper health centers, the reasons their roads are poor. So once we begin to make the connection between these normative frameworks and the lived experiences of people on the ground, we are able to inspire them to do some sort of action to push back against these governments. And that can only happen if people rise up. And I think that if we do those two things, there's an opportunity to push back against this kind of repression. Because people understand, people just have to make the connection between their lived experiences, that women are dying in hospitals, giving birth because of lack of medical workers or lack of equipment, simply because there is a government that they can't hold to account. And when you do this, you can begin to see this impact at local levels, that during elections, people are able to change leadership at the local level. In between elections, people are able to hold leaders to account, really put their feet to the fire if they have information, and make the connection between their lived existence, lived experiences, to these actions and to these rights that can be exercised.
So as a follow-up question, how do groups on the ground in Uganda connect with other groups elsewhere in Africa, but even around the world? Because the phenomenon you're describing is not unique to Uganda. It's occurring, like you said, in Hungary, it's happening in India, in Russia, in so many countries around the world, Philippines. So is there a sense of global civil society solidarity that is occurring on the ground from, let's just say, Kampala to Cairo or to Budapest, not necessarily just coming out of Geneva or London or New York?
What is certainly true is that these states are learning from each other and exchanging ideas. And you can see this by the replication of legislation. What begins as legislation in Ethiopia targeting financing of the nonprofit sector is quickly replicated in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. It catches on. So these leaders are exchanging worst practices. On the other hand, we don't see as much connectedness and cooperation between nonprofit sector actors to be able to make the connection. And I think we are perhaps guilty of two things. One, thinking of civil society only in terms of very narrow framing of registered non-governmental organizations, because the civil society is much wider than that. And even just in the country alone, you have silos of work where registered NGOs don't look at trade unions or professional associations as part of the broader civil society. And so it is going to be important for civil society in Uganda to be able to organize in the country first before they can organize outside. What we are seeing are very loose connections that are based on issues. So there's a rising LGBTI movement across the African continent that's doing an excellent job in providing support. The Ugandan group is right now involved in discussion around the LGBTI law in Ghana. They have been in the past involved in campaigns in Kenya, in Tanzania, in South Africa. So the corporations are still in silos and based on issues. But I think that, yes, it is critical that there has to be some connection between, because there are many excellent initiatives that have produced results in many countries. You know, in some countries, like in Zambia, the civil society movement galvanized to stop a leader from amending the constitution to run for a third term. And there's so much to learn from that kind of example. But right now, I don't think that is being done effectively as it should be. It presents an opportunity for learning better practices or best practices, but also to be able to pull together as a movement to try and challenge states.
Thank you. So a question from the audience: are these civil society restrictions applied to both domestic and international organizations? And given these challenges, how are civil society organizations functioning?
So these restrictions are being applied across the board, and in fact, even being applied more aggressively against international NGOs. You know, cases, for example, in Rwanda, where Human Rights Watch was expelled and they cannot access the country anymore. In Uganda, in the run-up to the election, staff members of, for example, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, or the European Union, who are working on elections, were expelled from the country. And so this is targeting local as well as international organizations. In the case of Uganda, even development partners like the Democratic Governance Facility, which is an EU member country basket fund for promoting democratic rights in Uganda, closed, suspended for now over a year and a half, and then nothing happened. So there's an attack on. I think that the response, in my view, has been twofold. The first is now that there's a growing call for people not to register because they have an inherent right anyway to associate. Registration is itself a limitation. In our experiences, you're like a goat tied on a rope. You can only eat on a circumference. You're tethered to circumference. And so people are beginning to realize that registration as an NGO is now a limitation, and therefore what is important is for people to be able to exercise their right as citizens and organize without registration. So you'll begin to see a rise of informal associations and coalitions that challenge this regime that has been established to ensure that people are, restricted. The second thing is that people beginning to reimagine means of organizing, because dependency on donor grants from outside the country has its own difficulties. And so people begin to reflect on local philanthropy and ways of sustaining the work in country. And so you have, for example, Civic Source Africa, a group based in Uganda, whose sole motive is to inspire local philanthropy, to allow people to be able to move away from dependence on grants from outside the country, but to be able to get support from the country. Because it has two things, besides just being a sustainable means, it also infuses legitimacy, because the criticism against NGOs is that they become so formal and detached from the population. Local philanthropy and contributions will help to infuse legitimacy and draw the nonprofit sector closer to the population. And in many ways, as a result, give it more force to be able to influence the state.
You bring up an interesting point about the role of domestic versus foreign philanthropy. And the reality is, in many contexts, there is a sort of a tradition or legacy of giving, but it's not always to formal NGOs, right? It's through charitable efforts or religious efforts, et cetera. So what recommendations would you have for domestic philanthropy and also for international philanthropy? Because very often those entities have their own challenges in terms of the ways in which they approach the relationship with local CSOs. You're on mute, Nicholas.
Oh, great, sorry. Even after many months of Zoom, we can still make these mistakes. I'm sorry. So you're absolutely right. The reality is not the absence of the culture of giving, because our people give, people are generous. It is what they give for and what they give to. In many parts of the African continent, the culture of giving is well established. But a combination of things happen when you are cutting a check for a human rights organization. You're most likely going to be threatened by the state. And so there is a sense of fear for people to contribute to human rights work, or really just democracy work. The tendency is for you to support the people in power. And so because you have to keep your lights on. And so it's a difficult thing to do. But increasingly, there's now been an expansion of what I see as opportunities to give, because you don't have to cut a check. You can give your time, give your expertise, give your compound for a gathering, give a vehicle to transport people. So there is now giving in kind, which I think is going to be a good segue to actual giving in cash if people can do. In terms of international donors, I think there's a real opportunity here to democratize giving and give to not causes we design in our capitals, but supporting people's movements on the ground. Because oftentimes, development partners have their own agenda, and the nonprofit sector normally just acts like a subcontractor of this interest. And I think that for me does not help to develop or enhance the nonprofit sector. What has to be done, I think, for me, is beginning to be a little bit more humble from international donors to realize that for many of these people on the ground, it's a matter of life and death. They know best what they should do. They know best what their needs are, and being able to support them unconditionally, therefore, is important if international philanthropy is to have any meaningful impact. The second thing is this, that philanthropy in many parts of the global West, in spite of just being opaque and having their own interests, also have to realize that the local entities and groups for which they are supporting do not need simply their grant purposes of making a bank account. In essence, there's an over-obsession with formality. So the reason NGOs have to register is because if you don't register, a foundation will not give you money. They want to see a state certificate, they want to see a bank account, they want to see an NGO certificate. And yet the experience of NGOs on the ground are that registration itself is inhibiting as opposed to enabling. And so being able to be flexible to deal or work with differently registered, or otherwise people call them in NGO terms, informal. I don't think they are informal. I think what we have are differently organized groups that organize in different ways, different from what we know in the global West. They may not have a bank account, they may not have an office, but they are really frontline activists in some of the most important issues in their areas. And so if we are to be able to be impactful, we have to begin to imagine different ways of supporting these organizations over and above traditional, conventional, formal means of providing this kind of help.
Thank you. A question from our audience: what can be done to ensure that digital technologies contribute to opening rather than closing civic space?
That's a very broad and sometimes controversial topic. At the turn of the century, people, even opined that new technology was liberating technology, and then thought that that was going to be the answer to, global repression. I think scholars, in universities like Larry Diamond began what was called digital programs because they thought that that was the answer to the global problem. But what we have now seen is that the new technology is a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. It can be enabling, but it can also be very destructive. In my own country, for example, you had the use of Facebook as a tool for disinformation during election. Interestingly, by government-organized groups that eventually got shut down by Facebook. And as retaliation for that, government shut down Facebook from Uganda completely for the last 2 years. And then so new technology, digital technology is both enabling and can also be misused as we have seen in many parts of the world. But that said, I think it presents the best way for enabling access to information by a large number of our population. But in order for that to be operational, I think for me, a couple of things are important to reflect on. One is the question of access. These tools remain largely expensive, inaccessible to a vast majority of people in our country. So making them more accessible and affordable to the population will be really, really important. I think that groups like Facebook, Twitter, and these big tech companies can make these services available really at no cost, if not at limited cost, for a vast majority of our population. But the second thing is that they also must reflect on their algorithms, that these algorithms are not used to promote hatred, are not used to promote disinformation. In many parts of the world, there's now concerns about the ethical application of new technology and its impact on the rule of law. And so having these systems more democratic is as important as it is having them accessible to the people in the country, because let's face it, it is perhaps the only place where people can organize. In my country now, you cannot have a peaceful protest, because to have a peaceful protest, you must get the permission of the police, not just any police, the Inspector General of Police. So whether you're in the countryside, you must write to the Inspector General of Police. And so the only way then to mobilize, then it just becomes online, because you cannot physically organize. And so digital spaces become very important avenues for access of information, for organizing, but for its potential to be realized, it must be accessible, it must be democratic, it must guard against some of its own vices, such as misinformation and disinformation. I think just 2 days ago, there's a report in the New York Times about a group called SEMA, based out of San Francisco, that has a digital center in Nairobi, that has hundreds of people being subcontracted by big digital companies in the Silicon Valley to monitor disinformation. And then some of the things that they're doing there are adversely reported. I think these digital companies have got to reflect on these kind of things to make sure that their spaces are used for the right reason.
Thank you. So when we, over the span of this hour, we've touched on the role of heads of state in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa, either people who have, sort of secured power through the ballot and have remained in office, or have come in through coups. We've touched on the role of multinational corporations, particularly in the extractive industry, to perpetuate the closing of civic space. And we've also talked about global standard setting organizations, multilaterals, philanthropies that have inadvertently perhaps, deepened sort of power inequities. I'm wondering if you can touch on the role of China at this point in Africa. Where are the challenges? Where are the opportunities in terms of this issue of civic space? You're on mute, sorry.
Great. Again, sorry. So I'm just saying two things. There's no doubt that there's an increase in Chinese investment on the African continent. Many of these investments are in the infrastructure sector, the extractive industries. And so you have lots of Chinese money building roads, extracting oil, or building power dams across the continent. What is characteristic of Chinese investment on the continent is that, one, they are riddled with corruption. Chinese entities are happy to bribe African leaders to be able to get large contracts. But secondly, they don't care about human rights. The discussion around respect of local communities, cultural sites, diversity, environment, they just simply don't care. Those discussions take second place. And the reason many of these countries now rely on China is partly because of the inward-looking nature of governments in the global West. We do not seem to be as open as it used to, and most certainly in the US, the last administration just gave China, a blank check. But over and above that, there is now a growing realization that Chinese investments are by their own nature extractive, exploitative, and not intended for the wider developmental agenda of these countries. And you have to look at, if we have a natural disaster, let's say there's a hurricane, or there is earthquake, there is a pandemic on the continent, these countries still rush to traditional allies in the global West. They don't go to China. I think that it is because there's a long-term value connection between the global West and many African countries. And the inward-looking nature of their intervention has given China, and perhaps even now Russia, a free run on the continent. I think that global Western countries must begin to find their voices again, not just to stand up against violation of human rights, but to ensure that adverse Chinese investment is countered by increased engagement of both the private and public sector on the continent. Because Chinese intervention is short-term, it's exploitative. There's now discussions in Uganda about Chinese contracts that are intended to grab national assets. That discussion is going on in Kenya as well as in Zambia. That these contracts are made in ways that, and I've read some of these contracts. These contracts, for example, require that agreements between these countries resolved in accordance with Chinese law. These disputes are resolved by the Chinese Center for Arbitration and not national courts. And so people are beginning to see the negative impact of Chinese investment on the continent. But I think that the global West hasn't yet seen and still act in ways that are fraught with fear, and in this sense that China might take over Africa. I don't think that that's going to be possible. The African continent is still deeply connected culturally, socially, to their traditional allies in the global West. These allies just have to step up to the plate and deepen these relationships in ways that respond to the exploitative nature of the investment from Beijing.
So before we wrap up, I'm wondering if you can share the names of some groups that might be helpful for our audience to check out their websites or follow them on social media just to learn a little bit more. You touched, for example, on the work on sexual minorities, Uganda and Frank Mugisha, but there are others. Perhaps you could just share the names of 3 to 4 groups that are working on issues of closing civic space that would be of interest to us.
So on issues of the financing of the global, of the nonprofit sector in Uganda, a good group to follow would be Civic South Africa. Civic South Africa is an innovative group that seeks to reform the philanthropic sector on the continent. They are rethinking ways of domestic fundraising and sustainability. So look out for Civic South Africa. Follow their CEO, Jackie Asimwe Mwesigwe. She's on Twitter, and you can go look at their work. In terms of the civil society as a whole in Uganda, follow very closely the work of groups like Action Aid Uganda and the Uganda National NGO Forum, as well as the Uganda Women's Network, because these are groups that are on the cutting edge of organizing. They are mostly network groups that are spread all over the country, but they're also groups that are facing the wrath of the state. If you have time, please also look out for Chapter 4 Uganda, the organization that I lead and founded. It's going through some problems at the moment. It's been suspended by the state, but that is being challenged in the court of law. On the 18th of March, we will get a judgment of the court. We hope we will get a good judgment and reopen the organization, but we are still active online. Look out for Chapter 4 Uganda. For those interested on issues of LGBTI, the Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum is an important group alongside Tala Foundation, as well as Sexual Minorities Uganda. These are groups that are on the cutting edge of advocacy around human rights in Uganda. For those interested in East Africa, there's a fantastic group out of Arusha called the Pan-African Lawyers Union, led by charismatic Kenyan lawyer Donald Dare. He's perhaps been the most active group at the African Court on Human and People's Rights, as well as the East African Court of Justice. They are based out of Arusha in Tanzania. All these groups are online and you can look them up.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to share 3 sort of takeaways for me from this very rich presentation and discussion. The first is, as Nicholas said in his opening remarks, that the closing civic space issue is one that is deliberate, it's contemplated, and he used the word calculated. So this is not just a naturally occurring phenomenon or something that happened accidentally as a byproduct of other trends. It is really something that is in the playbook. The second takeaway I have is that there needs to be this clear connection, and to use Nicholas's words, he says, between normative frameworks and lived experiences. And I think that is something that's really critical for us as we look to the future, connecting the dots between these various perspectives and experiences and approaches. And finally, I would say, each of us in our roles, whether we're working in international civil society, philanthropy, multilateral institutions, global governance institutions, each of us has a role to play to think about how this phenomenon is developing. What is our institution's roles in either perpetuating these trends or encountering them? And how do we listen to the voices and experiences of those on the ground with the most direct experiences in these areas in order to craft more creative, nimble approaches for the future? So thank you, Nicholas, for joining us today, and thank you to our audience as well.
Thank you very much for having me, and appreciate the